Welcome everyone. I'm Jeffrey Goodman, Director of Marketing and Development for the YMCA of Northwest Louisiana, and we're here today for Shreveport-Bossier, my city, my community, my home. My guest today is Candace Higginbotham. So Candace, thanks so much for being with us.
Sure, thanks for asking.
Absolutely. All right, Candace, well, correct me if I'm mistaken. I believe you worked for many years for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, as many people know it.
I worked as a federal employee for 15 years for HUD in the local field office. I worked for 20 years with the Department of Community Development, which included HUD as well as Department of Labor, Brownfields, Economic Redevelopment, Small Business Development, other funding.
And talk to me about some of the roles and responsibilities of HUD and the department's connection and importance to this community, like why we should care and what we should know about what HUD has done inside of this community.
HUD is, of course, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And it grew out of some discretionary grants that were trying to help communities deal with, among other things, disasters, as well as, of course, housing shortages, poverty. The market, the free market, is composed of folks who do great work in developing housing and apartments, etc., multifamily developments. But it is, as is normal, profit driven, and there's a much higher profit margin in the upper end of the housing market. And you can build a house that would cost $250,000 could be improved to be a house that was $500,000 without that much additional investment, because the infrastructure is part of the basic cost. But of course, people are going to do what is healthiest for their business and their employees and their stockholders. So traditionally, there has been very little development of housing for middle income and low income households. Back in the Reagan administration, he came up with what is called a low income housing tax credit to encourage developers to do housing for low and middle income people, and that's still in existence. But it's also a matter of trying to ensure that people have options to live in safe, decent, and affordable housing. In many communities, including ours, there is a significant level of poverty due to a lot of different socioeconomic factors and historic factors. And we have neighborhoods where the housing stock has greatly declined. It's been bought and used for rental housing, and perhaps not, in many instances, not maintained the way it should be. So people have very limited options. And it's not inexpensive. So for years, HUD built housing for low-income people, and they were all put in one place. And about 20 years ago, a little more than that, they realized all we're doing is concentrating poverty and everybody in the same place in corners of the cities that nobody wants to live in. And so they began doing mixed income sliding scale developments with an emphasis on access to grocery stores, pharmacies, transportation, etc. And it's made a significant improvement in housing availability, but we're still very, very short on housing for the average middle class family, working class families, as well as low income. And I think, it's a condition that is global. It's It's just the nature of the market. But there are efforts to try to improve that. I worked for HUD for 15 years. I did work with the Department of Community Development for the city with grant writing and grants management for everything from, as well as HUD funds, but also Department of Labor funding for job training for people who had been laid off. For example, the dislocated workers from the manufacturing that we had, that we lost 30% of in 3 years, or it was actually more than that. But that was, when everybody was moving to South America or China for low labor costs and higher profit margins. But I also worked with funds that were foundation. We started the first brownfields program in Shreveport.
And talk to me, for people, I know what that term means, but for people that don't know what brownfields are, would you mind clarifying that?
When EPA was running the Superfund program, which was all of these places that had been abandoned and had multiple contamination issues from industrial use typically. So nobody wants to touch them, because once you buy it, that problem is yours. You may not even have known it was there, but it's yours. So they began to try to come up with alternatives for use of brownfields depending on the proposed use. And they called them brownfields because they stayed brown. They stayed undeveloped, unredeveloped, even though they already had infrastructure, utilities, access, etc. But
and my understanding is, in kind of the opposite, is a greenfield. Usually, people will call a new development something.
Exactly. It's easy to cut down trees and put in a new development somewhere. But of course, it may not be the most efficient way to keep employment and to save your core cities. So at any rate, what Brownfields programs did was to give opportunities for people to apply for assistance. First, you did a catalog of all the, quote, brownfield properties in your community, and the city's first grant for that, Dr. Gary Joyner, the history professor at LSU Shreveport, did much of the work in getting the historical background. Anytime you do any kind of development on site with federal funds, you have to have what's called a SHPO, and that's historic, preservation, which include analysis, which also includes the former use and whether or not. Obviously, you don't want to. There's sites you don't want to build housing on, but you can do something commercial. What McDonald's ended up doing, for example, is going into inner cities and developing McDonald's restaurants by putting down a concrete slab over everything, and then it's fine. Then you don't have to worry about it. You don't plant. If you do a plant, you do a planter on top of it with the soil that you bring in yourself, but there's no danger of contamination to the community. Similarly with, for example, lead-based paint, a lot of beautiful older houses were torn down or were not maintained because of the issues of lead-based paint. The dust can be tremendously detrimental, especially to children below the age of 6. So when we're calling developmental delays and cognitive issues. So if you sand it and repaint it, you've got to make sure that you've contained all those dust particles, and that the people who are, they come home with them on their clothes, right? The people who do that work. And it's disposed of as toxic waste. But if you sheetrock over that wall, it's encapsulated and it's not a problem. They began looking at ways of ensuring that these inner city sites could be used again without having to spend millions on removing all of the contaminants. If you can contain them, then there's there's some industrial sites in Shreveport that have been redeveloped basically because of the brownfields program.
Is that still in effect, the Brownfields program, locally?
Yes, it is. I mean, it's a factor. The funding is not as significant as it used to be. It was never enormous, but and there was a HUD, Brownfields Economic Redevelopment Program, that it was competitive grant funding, not formula, and it's not something that a city gets every year that it competes for. And when I was with the HUD field office, I was like a HUD partner in the EPA's Brownfield program and rating proposals from another region, not from any proposals in our region. And some of them would just make your heart hurt reading them. For example, places like Michigan and the water situation in Flint, or in West Virginia, where all of this cold silt and dust has been dumped in mountain streams and contaminated the water, and the water's like red, and they need help cleaning that up. But it's not a formula grant. It's not something that comes around every year for cities that need it. There's way too much need to be able to fund that. But and it's not funded for competitively with as much money as it was at one point. But it's still a viable program, and it's very, very helpful in communities in both attracting redevelopment within the city core and also in developing housing for middle and low-income families.
Great. All right, well, I'll move into something that's fairly specific. I believe you were deeply involved, if I'm not mistaken, in the Choice Neighborhoods project.
Yes.
Can you talk some about the process of securing the monies for the project, where Choice Neighborhoods is located, and why it's an important development for our community?
Okay. They closed field offices all over the country, mostly to where there was HUD did in budget cuts, to where there was only one in the state. So of course it was us and New Orleans, and we had like the northern 50-something parishes, and they had basically Baton Rouge, New Orleans, and the toe of the boot. But at any rate, I did not want to move to Fort Worth to the regional office. And I decided to retire instead. And a couple of months after that, the city had put out a request for proposal for people to apply to be the Choice Neighborhoods Coordinator. And they were they had a planning grant, and they had completed the planning grant and wanted to apply for an implementation grant. And so I went through that bidding process. Not really bidding, it was a competitive process, and was chosen. I had been the coordinator for my field office for those types of, but I was in field policy management, not in the grant side. But at any rate, so I had specific background that made me suitable for it. And I did that for 7 years. Choice Neighborhoods is an approach that moves away from, for example, after Katrina, the housing development that was destroyed, it was proposed that it not be replaced there in the 9th Ward. There's flooding issues, all the reasons why it would not be sustainable. But there was a lot of community support and political support for doing that. So that's what they ended up doing. And of course, it got destroyed too. Not as badly as Katrina, but nevertheless, it doesn't make sense to build housing for people in areas where they don't have good transportation, they don't have good schools, they don't have access to health care, they don't have grocery stores, the little mom and pop places, they're convenient, and God bless them, they're small businesses in a neighborhood, which are very important. But the other thing is they have to charge more because their profit margin is, so minimal. Grocery stores, we did a study with an entity, Brown Supermarkets on the East Coast, they'd been asked to go in and build supermarkets in food deserts, places where there were no grocery stores, and most big chains have. And they had done it successfully several times. And so they decided to they said, look, we don't need to be the only people doing this. So they created a nonprofit that would go in and do a market analysis, visit the main grocery stores in the area, and of course, from the standpoint of a man who runs a large chain of grocery stores successfully, the management and technical expertise, market expertise. So they did that here, and I had not realized until we had this consultant come in that the margin for a grocery store, the profit margin, is only about 3%, which is why they all want to sell alcohol. Well, in, for example, Allendale and Ledbetter, you can't go 3 blocks without bumping into a church, and there's the state of Louisiana provision that you can't sell alcohol within 300 feet of a church or school. There was lots of land, but land that was level enough, not hilly, level enough, and had the access to enough land to have a back, the deck where shipping comes and goes, that sort of thing, was just almost impossible to find. Nevertheless, there was a lot of good things about getting that information. We still don't have a grocery store there, but that doesn't mean that we're not trying. And there's been, of course, a good deal of additional development, such as the MSKIC development that's run by Southern University. It's a small business development. We had, when we did the focus groups, the meetings with residents and other interested parties, stakeholders, we realized there were a lot of people who were catering out of their homes on a small level to make a living and doing some good work, but they could not afford to do a commercial kitchen. So the kitchen incubator was one of the projects that grew out of that planning process, and that had tremendous support both from residents and from business people who participated in the exercise, and is now up and running and helping grow small businesses. They won't be there forever. It's kind of like Cohab. It's like to get started and get the business management training that you need, as well as learning the industry standards and what's required to run a commercial kitchen and that sort of thing. So that was one of the projects. All of them came through a community vetting process, and there were boards of local residents and business people who reviewed the information that came in from all those public hearings. Choice Neighborhoods is targeted towards neighborhoods that have had public housing developments, and with the emphasis on, and of course it's very, very competitive. We were the first mid-sized city to get one. But it is to look at not just the site where the housing funds are going to be used, but for the community, and to promote educational opportunities, good schools, transportation, healthcare, access to healthy foods. And there are lots of partnerships in that grant program that include elements of all of that. Of course, we were competitive in part, I think, because of public transportation improvements that changed to minibuses that went through neighborhoods, so that automatically improved it. Or developments of grocery stores, for example, with 6,000, what they call 6,000 rooftops, is enough to be competitive. If you have a location, we had learned that most of the people in Allendale were shopping either at Brookshire's on North Market or at Brookshire's on Kings Highway. And with a large population of elderly, they were taking the bus. And that's still a challenge, but it's one that the more redevelopment that we are able to do, the more likelihood that we will be able to meet that challenge as well. And of course, there are other elements looking for the development of a grocery store downtown, and you have wonderful things like Cotton Farms and Shreveport Common that are creating opportunities for multiple artistic and community-oriented activities, as well as family entertainment. I'm not sure I answered.
You did.
Your
No,
question.
that was great. That was great. All right. My next question is: you spent a career in public service. For those listening to you who want to do more for the community and/or who are considering pursuing a career in public service, what words of wisdom can you share with them?
There is tremendous need. I grew up with in a family that my parents had been born like at the end of the Spanish flu, which of course wasn't Spanish, but and grew up during the Great Depression. Lived through World War II. My father tried to enlist and they wouldn't let him because he was a railroad engineer, and they said, "We need you running trains," and he came home in tears, because he couldn't sign up. But at any rate, and a mother who was very, very active in the community, and who did remarkable things, and never really wanted the attention. She was involved in better education for children. She was involved in civil rights efforts. There were groups of both Democrats and Republicans who met trying to, the turbulent 60s, trying to develop ways that government could be more responsive to those who were marginalized or left out. And there were a lot of remarkable women in that generation, of which Sylvia Goodman is one, that did extraordinary things. And when you think about the fact that it wasn't until 1977 when, it had finally been retracted, but the case where, women couldn't own property, they couldn't have bank accounts unless their husband signed on it, they couldn't have credit cards. And I think it was maybe 1972 before they rescinded that law. It was kind of bizarre. You don't think of it that way. But they also did work on creating a response for the homelessness that began to creep into our neighborhoods, which were the result of a number of factors, one of which was pretty much shutting down all the mental hospitals, or most of them, after some abuses were found. But it left all these folks just loose in the community. And then, of course, we had young men and women coming back from Vietnam who had PTSD and other disorders related to their service. I think even now, about a quarter of the homeless are veterans. But they began programs for that. If we don't get out of our own neighborhoods, maybe we're not that aware of what the need is. But there are folks who did, and as one of my favorite professors would tell his class, his first class in college was, as you go through life, try to look at things from the balcony. And he would use a metaphor of kids going to a dance, and the ones who were close to the stage, it was hot, the band was loud, and there was a lot of people there, it was great. People a little further back, said, yeah, it was pretty well attended, it was nice, the band was good, it was not quite loud enough, and then there were people at the back who couldn't hear, and it didn't look like there was hardly anybody there. But if you went up to the balcony, you could see the big picture. And it was a metaphor that influenced me and has sustained me in many ways my whole life. But what I saw growing up was what people could do in their own community just by volunteering, just by participating in PTAs and the Conference of Christians and Jews, organizations that were community-based organizations designed to meet a particular community need, churches that worked together to address problems in the community and hunger and homelessness. We still have a lot of heroes out there. Most of them, nobody really knows that that's the case, but some very distinctive people that have dedicated their careers to, whether they are working people with small businesses or employees of other businesses, or women staying home and raising children, or caring for elderly parents. There are volunteer opportunities for everyone. The Martin Luther King Health Center, which Sister Margaret started in the Bottoms, for example, was with, a young resident that would come volunteer his time and see people in the soup kitchen, because there were a lot of homeless there then on Spray Street, that bloomed into, with support from multiple local churches. It was struggling to survive, and community leaders, and by that I mean people who have stepped up most of their lives, whether or not their names are common to the general public. There are a lot of these people in our community, and it is something to be proud of, and I think that a lot of people don't realize how much they give to the quality of life of the community. At any rate, I was the youngest child. My brother's 11 years older. He ended up being an Air Force colonel in Vietnam, and he was in the Pentagon on 9/11, as a matter of fact. But I watched my mother's activities in education, in programs for the elderly, and with a network of people who were working, trying to make things better. And I was really inspired by that. When I got to college, of course, I really loved doing community theater, and I thought I'd major in theater, and end up selling insurance like a lot of kids that did. But at any rate, I got down to Baton Rouge, and at that point in time, the theater department was very limited because they could not charge admission to their plays. They could only operate on what the legislature budgeted for them. And so that they could only do things that were in the public domain. They didn't have money for costumes. They didn't have money for scenery, And Shreveport was such a thriving arts community with multiple community theaters and a symphony that, frankly, when I got to Baton Rouge, was obviously much better than Baton Rouge Symphony. No intent. I lived in Baton Rouge for 10 years. I don't want to diminish the value of that community, but in ways it made me more appreciative of Shreveport and the cultural resources that were and still are here. And we can go on a long list of those, but that would be another conversation. Nevertheless, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I ended up in graduate school in political theory, which really, actually, I learned a lot from. And I took part-time jobs in state government. You know, I worked for intergovernmental relations, which was back when computers were just, I'm aging myself, of course, but that's obvious, were, you know, just beginning to be utilized, and it was a very, very rudimentary system, a big computer and a computer science graduate student who was running it and doing, putting in keywords for people who were looking for funding for projects and trying to help them find federal resources to help address community needs. And then from there went to the Louisiana Commission on Law Enforcement, working with three law students and me, a political science graduate student, working on the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act funding that came to the state of Louisiana, and how those funds were used, doing public hearings in courts, police, corrections. It's been a while. There was one or two more. At any rate, in different areas of the state to get public input and feedback on what was happening. And in the process of that, I worked with Elaine Hunt, who was director of the Department of Corrections at the time. And I was working on you had to write a manual for each of those areas on the feedback you'd gotten from the community and what the gaps were and what the needs were and that sort of thing. So at any rate, she ended up asking if I could be loaned to her because they were under the court order for Angola, the conditions at Angola, and the consent decree, to help document that. And that lady worked, she was amazing. I would come to the Department of Corrections office after I had my last class, usually about 3 o'clock, and we might leave at 3 o'clock in the morning. She was an amazing woman and did remarkable things, and unfortunately died of pancreatic cancer. But she created the Reception and Diagnostic Center that every prisoner would go through to evaluate mental potential for violence, aptitude, educational, employment histories, and determine, okay, what is the best, while we have this person, first of all, what's the most secure place to put them so that we just don't throw everybody together. And secondly, what can we do if it's no more than help them be literate to improve their possibilities of not being a repeat offender when they get out. There were a lot of really great improvements made. But then I was, well, it might have been in between. I worked for the Department of Planning and Health Planning and Development. And I was working on the Certificate of Need process of where hospitals and nursing homes and healthcare facilities, rather than just, if they were receiving Medicaid funds or Medicare funds, that they weren't overbuilding, because if they're empty beds, it raises the cost for everybody because you're paying for the cost of the infrastructure for those empty beds. So they would have to apply for a certificate of need to do an expansion or a new facility or that sort of thing. And that was eye-opening too. And one of the things I learned, the influence that certain lobbies in the market were able to have over legislatures, and it's no different than it is today, where you have big corporations who are able to support candidates that are compatible with their, be favorable to their interests. But so I kind of got a bird's eye view of a lot of different resources and governmental agencies and activities. And my parents, of course, wanted me to move back home, and they were getting older. I was the youngest, and they were doing some hiring with the Bill Hand administration, and they had an advertisement for a planning unit manager to manage planning unit, meaning grants, in what was then a special programs office. They didn't know where to put them, so they put it under that umbrella, and it became the Department of Community Development. So I came up for the interview thinking, this is probably the best interview I've ever had for a job I don't particularly want. And then, of course, they offered me the job, and it was significantly more than I was making at my graduate student level. And I came, and I knew from the time I was fairly young that whatever I did, I wanted to have some kind of connection to public service, because I witnessed what it can do. And I witnessed people who made a difference. And it was the perfect place for me, because I had knowledge of federal, state, and foundation resources that I knew how to do needs assessments for communities. I knew how to work collaboratively with people to identify community needs and grant writing. So I did. I managed the planning unit there, and then ended up becoming the assistant director, and for a while the acting director. And then HUD offered me a fellowship to be a fellow for a 2-year period. They had not promoted people except from within in almost 20 years. And they said, we need people who have actually run programs, and been in communities. So they brought in what they call Community Builders program, and to work in field policy management sections, which is the management piece of field offices, and to engage with communities. And so I did that, and at the end of the 2 years, they had put out vacancies that we could apply for, and I was one that was lucky enough to get one. So I ended up staying there 15 years. It is some of the most frustrating work because, what you also see, unfortunately, is segments of the community working against each other because they're in competition rather than collaboration. But that's the human condition. That's just the way we are. And that's one reason churches are so important in helping address community needs that, the market doesn't. But they can't do it by themselves. It takes some really strong nonprofits who have capacity, and like everything else, somebody needs some serious management training, or it ends up devolving into personalities, and being able to have a good organizational structure and a board that is active and not a rubber stamp. But it was very fulfilling, and it was very helpful when I went to work for the city on a contract basis to work with the Choice Neighborhoods Initiative and community meetings and writing grants to address the projects that the community process had identified to be a competitive application. And that's still going on, and there are lots of good things that a lot of people don't even, probably not aware of, that are still going to happen. But it's also a piece of the redevelopment of downtown and job opportunities. And again, we're talking about mixed income housing. It's not a public housing development that's stuck in a corner and nobody wants to go in a neighborhood, and it meets standards for being appropriate in the community, giving opportunities for job opportunities for youth and extra educational opportunities. So it's a great network and collaborative effort that it took, and Bonnie Moore, it would never have happened if Bonnie had not been in the place that she is in, was able, and she has tremendous respect both within the community and also nationally. It was one of the things that helped make us competitive, but also her vision and her ability to do those things, to bring community people together and address in a nonpartisan way community needs, and letting people vocalize what they see as community needs. They used to say, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you, is the scariest words. I think Reagan said that. And there's been, it's for decades now, disparagement of public employees and public servants. But let me tell you what, they're some of the finest people I've ever met. And it's not by accident. They choose to do that even though they could make more in the private sector. And their integrity is important. And if there's Hatch Act and all sorts of regulations on being nonpartisan, ethical standards that can get you fired. And people do get fired for it, and that's a good thing. But nevertheless, it's been a journey, and I'm proud to have been associated with many of those people. It's not that different. I worked in little private sector jobs here and there. You have the same issues with personalities and egos and that any personnel manager has. You have people trying to exert special interest from the outside, whether that be political or business and industry. The bureaucracy is endemic to any large organization. I also learned. I just assumed that this was only a governmental thing, until you, in the course of 2 months, you're ordering a new file cabinet, lateral file cabinet for an employee whose file cabinet is, falling apart. And the Xerox machines, of course, the copiers are done on a federal contract, bid out. And the guy with the new copier shows up before they pick up the old one, even though it is Xerox. It's a different company that picks up the old ones, that brings in the new ones, and they don't talk to each other. And it's people that have tried to deal with returning something. You find it everywhere. It's just a matter of, if you're big enough, it's inevitable, unless you find better ways for communication. And of course, I think we have them now, but they don't always. One piece of a company doesn't always speak to the other, and that's true, in government of entities that have to collaborate or at least communicate, and some do it better than others. And they may not know that somebody else is already doing this, So again, it's that balcony view that you have to try to keep in mind, even when things don't seem to be right. You go, wait a minute, let me back up and look at this. And you listen to all the different perspectives. And it's wonderful when you can achieve consensus with community people that started out with opposing interests and come to a consensus based on listening to each other. But we have to listen.
Great. You mentioned a little of this, but my next question is, can you talk about some of the people in the community who inspire you?
I'm afraid I'd leave somebody out, but I'll do it. There's so many. There are just so many. We could spend a couple hours and I'd still be talking. And many of them would never take credit for anything. They fly below the radar. They do what they do. They're not interested in being in front of a camera. They're not bragging on social media about what they do. But from, poor Sister Margaret was one. Also, the group of women who, and I'll be leaving somebody else out on that too, but who got together to develop an organization to serve the homeless. Ruby Scroggins, Dr. Ruby Scroggins, who grew up in Allendale and had a very difficult childhood, ended up getting a PhD at Northeast and took J.S. Clark and turned it completely around. Sister Sharon and the school health clinics that she has shepherded and continued to shepherd and work with. We can go back a lot further, but Bonnie Moore, who is soft-spoken, has tremendous historical knowledge of federal resources available to communities, knows every regulation, won't cross the line, regardless of how many politicians tell her that those funds need to be used for something else. She's like, it's like my first federal representative for grants administration with the city had an expression, and that was, "I'll do anything for you but time." It's public funds. You can't treat them as though they are your personal businesses, and it's not about you. You've got to look at the greater good and what the intent was, and the intent is legislation passed by Congress to meet a particular need, like the Dislocated Workers Program, when steel mills began laying people off and manufacturing began fleeing to cheap markets to reduce labor costs. It's hard not to list a gazillion. I think my mother was one, Myrtle Pickering, who worked with, who directed the Caddo Council on Aging and took it from a really small little agency to one with capacity and leadership that has followed in that same dedication. Dr. Ann Springer, who was critical in getting the Cara Center and Gingerbread House developed in Shreveport, and it is one of those things that it is so unfortunate that we need, and we are so lucky that we have it, and there's nothing like it in this region. And of course there were several people associated with that too. The young pastors who are now, some of them in their 90s, that were the core of the civil rights movement in Shreveport, and when the state banned membership in the NAACP, they established a Southern Christian Leadership Conference Association with Dr. Martin Luther King, and he came, and the recording of his speech at Galilee, it's called the Speech at Galilee, you can listen to it online. In it are all the underpinnings of the I Have a Dream speech. It was C.O. Simpkins, Dr. C.O. Simpkins, who brought him here. He made Reverend Harry Blake one of his first field sergeants or right arms, and of course Harry Blake almost lost his life just trying to hold a service for the children that were killed in the Birmingham church bombing. I could list all those names, but I'm sure I'd leave somebody out. But if you've ever, well, you know, of course, E. Edward Jones, Dr. Jones, Pastor McLean, and again, I'm going to leave some out. Nevertheless, the Civil Rights Coalition that was formed over a decade ago with the core of those pastors, and then of course you're talking about Dr. Sarpy and Maxine Sarpy, and they treated Harry Blake on a couch at Little Union after he was almost beaten to death. And if you've never heard Maxine speak, you've really missed you've really missed something. They were really bright. I mean, they hosted the national meeting of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Shreveport in 1962, with George Doratories here. You know, I mean, you think about the courage of those young folks, and all they were doing was trying to be able to register to vote, to be able to be served at a counter, to make a decent living for themselves, and to have their children be able to go to good schools. One of the things my mother did with, she was, you know, of course, with the Parent-Teacher Association for Caddo, but she was also like the legislative chair for the state organization. They proposed things like, they passed laws that prohibited taking small children out of schools in South Louisiana to peel shrimp, child labor laws, that type of thing. But she and a number of other folks like Aaron Silber, Charlton Lyons, the lady who ran for mayor ages ago.
Virginia.
Oh, and certainly Virginia Sheedy, yes, absolutely. And I should have mentioned her right off the bat too. Who just did things because they were the right thing to do, and they didn't think about how they might be perceived or how it might affect their social standing, or took their ethics, whether it was, well, their Judeo-Christian ethics for the most part, I suppose, and worked together to try to make things better. They really worked hard for education, and managed to make some significant gains in their lifetimes. Unfortunately, you know, we still got a ways to go, you know. Nevertheless, and I think a lot of it is, I remember when I was about 12, asking my mother why people didn't believe that, well, but then we called African Americans, or something worse, that they had so much difficulty in their communities and were often mistreated, taken advantage of, and worse. And she said, Candace, because if it doesn't happen to them or to someone they know, it's like, I don't believe that's happening. And yet, if you look at the data for Caddo Parish for the 50s and 60s, it was very bad. It was after, I don't know if you want this, but you can cut it out if you don't. After the incident at Little Union Baptist Church, I remember I was home from school and Mother came home from work. She was working for the Cattle Safety Council in the Medical Arts Building, and she came home crying and upset because she had seen horsemen herding children walking from BTW, and knew about riding horses in the church. And it really, really shook me that day. But it also opened my eyes to see what I might not have noticed. I was still pretty naive. But nevertheless, the folks that in that community, the North Louisiana Civil Rights Coalition has been collecting oral histories from these folks who were involved in the civil rights struggle. And a lot of what happened in Shreveport really did influence nationally. Dr. King came and taught a thing about nonviolence and how important it was in making change, nonviolent techniques for children who were going to be integrating Caterpillar schools, to avoid conflict if at all possible. But they've collected all these oral histories, and there are two sisters on the board of the Civil Rights Coalition that were the children of the custodian who lived in the house next door, or I think in churches we call them the sexton, or a lot of churches do. And they remember after that incident their father telling him to come help him clean up the church, because of course it was, the indoors with horses inside and everything you can imagine. So they were there helping him, and over the course of several days, a Shreveport police officer would come and stand in the back and watch him with his arms folded and his gun on his hip, which was pretty telling to those two children. Two little girls, you can imagine, and terrifying because they were there when it happened. So anyway, all of that's really important, and one of the things that the Choice Grant is doing in collaboration with some local foundations and other funding, along with the Choice funding, is saving Old Galilee, restoring it to its footprint. We can't restore it to, it's on the National Register as an architectural element to the historic district, but it's been commented by both federal and state historic preservation folks that it's earned one on its own because of the social history there. It's being restored to its historic footprint, which means, and if we'd waited much longer, it would have been too late. Structurally, cosmetically, it will look the same, but obviously you can't, to do a restoration, you have to use the same materials that were used to build it. That church was built pretty much by parishioners in the early 20s. It was founded by freed black slaves who built the first structure there, and just has tons of history. There were lots of meetings there for educational efforts, and of course also at Little Union and several other churches in that neighborhood. Churches were the foundation of black neighborhoods because there wasn't much other support available in a community, and ideally neighborhoods, people get to know each other and take care of each other, but there's less of that now than there was, and a lot of that is, there's lots of reasons for it, not to mention the internet and just the fact that everybody's working, or most everybody anyway. So there's not the time where there aren't moms at home co-parenting kids and that sort of thing, although there's still people who help each other in neighborhoods, and it is a sign of a healthy community when you can have that. If you don't, then everybody's got their own perspective and blaming somebody else for why things are the way they are. When I mentioned the statement about I'm from the government and I'm here to help you, the perspective that programs took, HUD programs at least, and others as well, was looking at the community as a whole, not just one piece that you're going to fix. And what are the other resources in the community, both private and public and nonprofit? What's missing? Getting people together to talk about what they see as the biggest needs and problems in their community. We have neighborhood associations, when I was with the city with community development as an employee, I talked a lot with Matt McCarter, who's another local hero who was developing his remarkable model. And I asked him if he'd talked to any neighborhood organizations. And he said, yes, but I have found that for some of them, they are more interested in keeping people out than letting people in. And he said in some cases, it's kind of like, the science fiction novel of the farmyard.
Animal Farm?
Yeah. If you're not careful, the pigs take over. Which was pretty insightful, I think. He realized in his ministry, he said he felt like from the pulpit he was throwing droplets of water and people were catching them in Coke bottles, rather than being in and among and listening to minister to people. And we think we know what people's problems are, but if we don't talk to them, we don't know, So rather than the government coming and telling you what they can do for you, it's do the due diligence, the research, and the community engagement, and you tell us what you need. And we'll see if it's something that is possible for government to be, if it's something that's obviously handled by the private sector, you don't want to do that because there's resources to do that already. But, in many cases there are not. And I've met some remarkable people in public service. We always think of politicians and, folks who are looking for attention to get reelected and all of that. But there are auditors and finance people and nonprofit executive directors and program managers who work extremely hard and don't get paid a lot. Peggy Shimwell is one of the heroes that I can name, who's sadly now not with us, but she was a psychologist who saw the growing homelessness in the community and was engaged with those other ladies to develop a response to try to deal with it, and decided not to practice anymore and founded a nonprofit, community support programs, to work with the mentally ill, homeless, and the dually diagnosed, because frequently people who are mentally ill or may have substance abuse problems, there's no shelter that's was going to let them in. And if they're going to be any difficulty, they get kicked out. So there was a need for people who had master's level social worker certifications and some psychiatric social workers to work with people. In many cases, you're talking about, it might be a veteran who is off his medication and the family has written off, or in some cases they see him once a month when he gets his disability check and he has a really nice time and they drop him back out to the street again. There's that happens too. But to work with folks, get them assessed, stable on their medications, and in the meantime keep them in transitional housing where they can have a case manager, and then help them get into an apartment, a job, and they've had remarkable success. Virginia Sheehy, there's a assisted living, supportive housing, which is one of the HUD programs that was developed for people with disabilities or for senior citizens to live independently rather than having to go into nursing homes, which they, at that point they don't need. They're physically okay, they just can't live alone because of their age or because of mental illness. And so they developed what was named Virginia Place because Virginia Sheehy gave them the land. And it's apartments for people with mental illness who are able to be stable and with, minimal support, case management support, getting them to doctor's appointments, helping them deal with insurance or Medicare or Medicaid issues. People can live in the community instead of being homeless and can be stable, some work. When they opened Virginia Place, there was of course, a little reception there, and I was working for HUD at the time, and so I was there for that reason. And one of the folks, and I don't know who they were, I wouldn't say their name if I did, but came up to Virginia and said, "Well, how do you feel about having this across the street?" And Virginia Sheehy said, "Well, I'm hopeful that it will be encouraging to other property owners to improve their property too." She was just wonderful. She really was. She and my mother were friends and contemporaries in working in the community, and the opportunities that I had to be exposed to her are so valuable. You look at the Beards and what they were able to accomplish in the foundation they achieved. The Selbers. There were folks in this community, both Democrat and Republican, who came together regularly to work on civic issues and try to find solutions. And we still had, lots of problems depending on, the economy, race relations, and school issues. But people were making a difference and making progress. That's still happening. It's just not as visible as it was. Now, they took some criticism for it, but, maybe they were naive. They didn't realize how vulnerable they could be, and certainly in today's environment. And it doesn't have to be that way. It's, well, for example, mothers work with a PTA. The school board asked the Caddo Parish PTA, this committee, I forget the name of it, but it dealt with quality in schools, to go visit all the black schools and file a report on it. And these women who were, very interested in improving educational opportunities for children said, "Sure, we will." And when they did, now this was in the 50s, this was in the late 50s, they were horrified at what they found. There were kids on dirt floors in old tumble-down churches with torn-up school books. And people say, "Oh, that's not true, it's not true." It was true. And they raised holy hell with the school board about it. And that's when they began building new black schools. Now, again, it was still segregation, Dr. Mildred Scott, for example, who graduated from Central Colored High School at 15 and got on a bus to the University of Maryland, where she ended up with a PhD in biomedical research. And eventually came back and chaired that department. Her mother still lived on Metal Street and was elderly, and Mildred came home to take care of her mother. And I think had retired from the university and started a nonprofit called SEA. Now this was like in the 89, 90, something like that. Science, Engineering, and Health Careers Program. Sound kind of like STEM, huh? Except it was a decade sooner. And she worked with kids after school in helping prep them for medical engineering, technology, science-related careers. She produced doctors and nurses. Below the radar. Didn't do the big meetings in front of the TV cameras on all the wonderful things they've done. And that's necessary for big nonprofits to do, I understand. But without making all that noise. And I can't help but thinking about that little 15-year-old girl on a bus in North Carolina. I've gotten way off topic.
No, that's great. Well, I'm gonna move you. I'm gonna move you to what's our final question, and that was great. I mean, there are a lot of people you talked about that I've never heard of, and that we probably need to know more about.
Yeah, well, there are a lot more that I don't know about either. But you have to simply be active in community efforts to bump into them, and I'll tell you what, it really makes a difference in your view of the community. Because when I was in high school, we called it Shreveport-itis. If it was from Shreveport, it couldn't be any good, and if somebody was from out of Shreveport, what could they know?
Well, I'm gonna move you into the final question. My final question for you is, as you look around our community now, what makes you optimistic about its future?
There are people who see the possibilities for beyond what we have done in the past. And that's the young men, and I say young, of course, it's my age, they're young, who have come back and I don't remember all their names, so I'm not going to mention any, but have taken the Sears building and done the redevelopment of that, of a coffee shop and commercial on the ground floor and residential above, and there's 3 or 4 other buildings. What people were able to see in the value of an arts district, and as hard as it was to get to the point where they finally did open have the pavilion open, Shreveport Common. And there's always folks in Shreveport that say, oh, it's not going to be any good unless the private sector does it. The private nonprofit sector is very important. And as I learned, I heard first from my mother, it's not just income, it's the quality of life that makes communities and cities places where people want to be and gather and interact. And when we talk to each other, when we have places that we can go and see each other instead of being exposed only to our limited little circle of friends and our block, our church, our own clubs that don't let everybody in. We see a much bigger picture, just like travel is educational. We see there are lots of ways to deal with certain elements of a city, or there are different creative ways that people help each other. There are places, where both the private and nonprofit sector have collaborated to do some things that couldn't have been done by either on their own. And that creates economic opportunity in and of itself. Anything that draws people creates economic opportunity. And Shreveport Common, you're making economic opportunity for artists. And, some of the projects in Shreveport Common have been held by choice. The efforts to save and redevelop those two iconic old houses on Austin Place. What's the name of it? The 3-story building that was the center of Black cultural life in the 20s. That I wish I've never been great at names, and it is getting worse the older I get.
It's all right.
The ballroom, and the remarkable things that woman did. I mean, it basically was a group of women. You had a thriving community in Ledbetter and Allendale that was integrated. There were both black and white people living there. That there were black businesses, but they didn't have the type of clubs, businessmen's clubs that white families did. But Cora Allen built that, conceived that, and built it, brought in some of the best entertainers in the state and around to a rooftop garden. And it was a community of black women, many of whom were business people, and they created office space for their husbands, entertainment for their families, and I mean, it was really extraordinary. It's one of the reasons Peggy Shinwell named that development, of townhomes. It's behind what is now the the dollar store, which when that was done, Liz Swain said it was the first new development in Ledbetter in 30 years. But it was a store for people to buy things that they didn't have to take a bus to Kings Highway or North Market, as well, and they carried some food items. But at any rate, the little 2 rows of 2-story townhouses, Peggy named the Cora Allen development after her because of the amazing things that she did and how little she's known. I love Cheryl White and the tours that she does in the historic cemetery of the yellow fever victims and what people have come together and done there to build a monument there that acknowledges. I mean, we lost, 24% of our population. We weren't even really a city then, but nevertheless, not really, but for the most part, people like Gary Joyner, who's continuing to do significant, like, for example, they found another graveyard there that they think is where the Shreveport father is buried, because and that was a couple that came from New Hampshire. I didn't even realize that till I finally was able to take her tour not too long ago. And there were like 70 people,
Wow.
Twilight in the cemetery. It was terrific, an open cemetery, Anyway, that keep digging in the dirt of community life and finding jewels, and many of them are our people. I just wish we had more respect for each other. Social media has made it possible to insult people and not be accountable, and it's a wonderful mechanism for keeping up with family members and friends, but it has become weaponized, and our enemies have used it against us. China and Russia are doing everything they can to split us apart, and by feeding into all of our worst characteristics to try to divide us. But the kids are smarter than we are. They always are.
Well, I appreciate you being here, sharing your story today, and you have such a unique and important perspective. So I appreciate you making the time.
I'm not sure I gave you what you wanted or what you were looking for.
You were great.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the people that you are profiling, because it's really important. We need to recognize those people, and there are. I am very well aware of some of them. They are reasons to be proud in this community. And we must remember the gains that have been made. We're not really very good at remembering the past. I don't even know how much history we teach anymore in public schools, but for some reason we love to complain. It's just human nature, and bad news gets more visibility and people are more likely to click on it than good news. And the people doing all this good work, they're not jumping up and down saying, hey, look at me. You have to want to find them, and it's not hard. It is not hard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.